Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with parapsychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we are going to explore the life and career of one of the world's most remarkable physical mediums, a man known as Franek Kluski. My guest is Dr. Zofia Weaver, who is on the Council of the Society for Psychical Research in England, and she has served as editor of the Journal of the Society for Psychical Research. She is also co-author with the late Mary Rose Barrington and the late Professor Ian Stevenson of the book A World in a Grain of Sand, which is about a remarkable Polish clairvoyant named Stefan Ossowiecki. Now, she also wrote the book Other Realities, the Enigma of Franek Kluski's Mediumship, which will be the subject of today's interview. Once again, this is an internet interview, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Zofia. I'm very happy to be with you again.
Thank you, and it's lovely to be here.
We're going to be talking about Franek Kluski. Now, I know that's not his real name, and I didn't think I could properly pronounce his actual name in Polish, but it's a name he used because he didn't really want to be publicly identified as a medium.
He certainly did not. His real name was Teofil Modrzejewski, which is a very respectable name. And one of his concerns was not to sully the name that he was going to leave to his children. And he felt that he would always be accused of cheating. He didn't really make mediumship his career. And so he basically did everything he could to dissociate himself from the subject. And I think one of the most interesting things about it was that one of his occupations was a writer. And you'd think, there you are, there you have material to write bestsellers, to make yourself popular. He never, ever wrote a word about his mediumship experience.
As I recall from your book, he was known as a writer of sort of comedy routines for cabaret performances.
Well, that was part of his career, but it wasn't a cabaret sort of funny, silly, sort of, more sort of slapstick. It was that in that period, there were in Germany and in many European countries, there were what they were called cabarets, which were sort of like political satire interspersed with jokes and songs and basically variety kind of shows. And he became very well known mainly because of his highly satirical political poems and sketches that became very popular, as well as his songs that sort of became hits without the author. So yes, I mean, that was only a part of his career. Later on, he tended to write more occasional verses, more patriotic. Since I wrote the book, as well as reading his earlier poetry, I managed to locate quite a lot of other things that now are available online. And they tend to be occasional, very patriotic poems. I've even managed to locate, but not read yet, his article on banking, which is, I've got to go to Warsaw, I've got to go to the National Library and get that volume. But a respectable banking publication has an item by him. So it just shows you the range of interest that he had.
And he was a banker.
He was indeed, yes. It was, I'm not sure, I think it was probably his main job. And that's what he was. And he wrote a column, a newspaper column on economics. So you couldn't really find a stranger medium than this.
Well, I think it's very interesting that his career began as a medium. His career as a medium began around 1918, which is the year that Poland established itself once again after more than a century of having been divided up by Russia, Prussia, and Germany. It became a nation, and right at the founding of the newly revitalized nation of Poland, his career as a medium emerged. So patriotism must have been very important in that era.
Oh, it was. And I mean, he interrupted his mediumship, his whole career, because when in 1920 there was a Bolshevik invasion, and he joined the army as a volunteer. So, I mean, it's all of a piece, but the actual 1918, it just happened that way, that he visited a friend, and there was a sitting there. I don't think he actually went particularly for a sitting, couldn't say, but the medium didn't produce very much, whereas things started happening around my friend Teofil, and it moved on from there because he became interested, and the person who was running that show at the time, his name is Sokołowski, he was a medical person, involved, started doing experiments with him. In fact, even in the very early days, they started doing paraffin molds, which seems to have been the standard thing to do with mediumship.
Now, you mention in your book that you had been aware of Kluski's mediumship for a long time and never thought about writing about it. And I gather you said it would have been pointless. And I suppose the reason being that the phenomenon described by the eyewitnesses were so strong and so bizarre and so varied that nobody would believe it anyway.
I'm afraid that was my attitude, and it might have, partly, as I've mentioned Mary Rose Barrington before. I mean, she kept pressing to know more, and she kept pressing me to do study days and things, so I always dipped into it. But the thing that really got me writing was reading the book by Filippo Bottazzi on Palladino. This was republished. I think it first came out in the 1900s. Then it was republished, and everything happens in a lab. All her phenomena with strange arms coming out of her side and torsos floating about. It all happened in a lab. And when you take that together with, say, Indridi Indridason and D.D. Hume, of course, the great one, suddenly you have a pattern. Once you have a pattern, I don't feel quite as uncomfortable as I did when I started reading about Kluski.
Well, you had an introduction to your book by Alan Gauld, who is known as a historian of psychical research. And he suggests that it's very possible that of all the great physical mediums of the past, and certainly the ones you've just named are names that would come to anybody's mind, that perhaps Kluski was the strongest medium of all of them.
Well, I really don't have a ranking for them. He certainly, I think he is the greatest ones that I can. I mean, D.D. Hume was something different. Indridi Indridason, in his own way, I mean, same kind of, perhaps on a greater scale in terms of pillars of light appearing all over the place. Kluski's are more chamber-like sort of events, mainly perhaps because he wasn't a medium. He wasn't, it was basically a home circle, apart from the Gelée experiments. So they are all much more muted. On the other hand, as I say, they followed him about. It would drive his family mad with all the knocks on the furniture and everything, and raps and constant strange events that followed him about, and the smells and the electrical equipment failing right and left and center. So he is, I think he's probably one of the greatest. But then, of course, as I say, he didn't do it professionally, which makes it more believable. On the other hand, we don't know as much as we could if only he had been more open about it.
And when you say he didn't do it professionally, I think it's important to note as far as the records are concerned, he never charged anybody for his services as a medium.
Oh no, I mean it was basically the Polish Society for Psychical Research and the French investigators that basically pushed and pushed and pushed. And since a lot of them were friends, there was, to start with, there was very much an atmosphere of, we've got a new force here, we've got some new physical phenomenon, let's investigate. And I think with time, first of all, he had, it really exhausted him physically as it went on. And secondly, I really do think he was uneasy about it as it became more and more mediumistic, which is sort of, he was concerned that it should not become part of a religious cult.
His mediumship, as I recall, lasted for just 7 years, from, I think, 1918 to 1925. He didn't die until, I believe, 43 or 44. So for the last 18 years or so of his life, he simply stopped practicing as a medium.
Not quite true, because, say, in 1928, there is a letter from Oste saying that he visited Kluski. He saw in good light paraffin molds forming, and he was so sorry that Kluski did not continue his mediumship. But he did. There is documentation that he did carry on with automatic writing, which he always preferred anyway. It was Gelée and Riche who wanted the permanent paranormal object. It's like, I think Matthew Manning mentions that as well, that, the physical phenomena declined if he was doing something like drawing, so it's the same with the automatic writing. It was a way of getting the gift out without exhausting him so much. And apparently there was some fascinating stuff there. Something I didn't put in the book is a report by one of the people who experimented with him. And one day Franek visited him at home, and they were talking generally, and then started talking about automatic writing. And suddenly Franek felt like having a seance, and started writing. And what comes across, it's like a lot of people, relatives of the person he was sitting with, saying, how is this possible? What's going on? You look a lot older. And who is this man? And then one of the relatives gives a bit of proof, recalls a conversation that was only known to the other person. So, okay, it's anecdotal, I know, but it sounds so good. When you read the account, it sounds so real, somebody says, what on earth is going on? So, yeah, and that went on. He went on with the automatic writing until right up to nearly to the war, because, again, no confirmation, but somebody who knew him and who was friendly with him and used to have automatic writing sessions with him, said that Kluski went to confession and was told by his priest to stop at once any meddling with things that aren't supposed to be meddled with, and stopped.
In Poland, the Catholic Church frowned upon anything having to do with spiritualism.
Absolutely, no. I mean, as I say, and it was very ingrained in both Kluski and the author of the book about Kluski. There are always sort of the implication, it's not really, it's not really interfering with religion at all. So, and some of the sitters sort of were very concerned that, perhaps they were doing something that they shouldn't do.
You report that during that 7-year period, there were many, many seances conducted privately in Kluski's home, and that the witnesses numbered maybe over 300 people.
Yes, indeed. There were plenty of people. He had a lot of friends because he had such varied careers. And as I say, the people themselves, they all signed the reports. There was no secrecy about it. And the person, the author of the book on which my book is based, made sure that everybody agreed that what they experienced was reported accurately. So yes, it's very, very well reported. Doesn't mean they couldn't have been fooled or hallucinating or what have you. I'm not saying anything. But it's difficult not to take their statements seriously.
And you also note that there were members of the Polish Society for Psychical Research, which in that era was among the more active societies in Europe, and that these people were well aware of the kinds of fraudulent tricks that spiritualist mediums, and particularly the physical mediums, were known for.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, apart from Żele and Riche, that obviously had experience, there are some lovely ones, some lovely stories in the Polish publication where they actually discover the medium, how the medium fakes the phenomena. There's one that has, as they tighten the control, the phenomena get less and less until one day, one evening, he's thrown into a costume and everything. And when they suddenly turn on the light, which you should never do, of course, because it might harm the medium, it turns out he's using his teeth to pull out the ectoplasms. So, as I say, they did have experience, yes.
You mentioned earlier, though, that the phenomena were not limited to the seances. And one of the most interesting examples that you report on apparently occurred in normal daylight, in which a full-bodied apparition or phantasm appeared. I recall it was a Turkish man and engaged in a lengthy conversation, even smoked a cigarette with a number of witnesses.
I know. I just do the reporting. But it's not the only report of that kind. I mean, for Kluski, yes, it doesn't happen very often. Although I don't know, there are other situations where people see him surrounded by characters. But I mean, if you look at Mirabelli, and again, who knows and apparitions generally, they do happen to people. What the connection might be, I have absolutely no idea. I just report what has been reported, and I hope one day people will take it seriously enough to actually examine that evidence and try and find out what it means.
In this particular example, as I understand it, one of the most interesting things to me is the phantasm. The phantom appears, a Turkish gentleman. He's engaging in conversation. They see a package of cigarettes on a table, I think maybe about 5 or 6 feet away, and offer one to him. And then he extends his arm. Of course, the normal human arm can't reach the cigarettes, but the arm becomes elongated, stretches out 5 or 6 feet, takes the cigarettes, brings them back, and offers the cigarettes to the other people in the room.
I know. It sounds crazy, doesn't it? But crazy things happen in lucid dreams and in sort of altered states of consciousness. I have no idea. But I think it's something we ought to be looking at, how we interact, how the material thing, the relationship between physical and mental is not perhaps as simple as you might think. In fact, if you take the idealist philosophy as a starting point, well, why not? If everything is the product of the mind, why not elongated arms? Is it that we just see what our senses are restricted to seeing and doing? I have no idea.
Now, and if I recall correctly, this particular example of the Turkish phantom who appears was witnessed by more than one person. In fact, I think more than 2 people.
Yes, indeed. And they got frightened. They weren't normally sort of too worried about seances, but this was the most impressive experience they ever had.
I think it's possibly the most impressive experience in your book, but certainly it wasn't the only example of the appearance of some sort of a ghost-like figure.
Oh gosh, yeah. There were so many, and such different kinds. Not to mention animals, but a lot of people recognized relatives, but then people do. But it wasn't like so many spiritualist situations where people recognize their loved ones, their lost ones. This was, you have a situation where people try to recognize somebody and the face changes as they watch. And some were very sort of nebulous. Some were so lifelike that you could touch them. And in fact, there is one situation where a couple of people decide to see how real the phantom is. And without breaking the chain, the circle, they reach out and punch the phantom. And the phantom sort of moans, objects. But the next day, the medium has a big punch on his chest where they hit him, where they hit the phantom, even though the medium was held, his hands were held all the time. So I have no idea what's going on.
You do show a few photographs in your book. One of them shows the appearance. It seems to be a bird. Like a wild bird, a large wild bird, resting on Kluski's head.
Yes. Now the photographs are. Now let me start somewhere else. Let me start by saying that I think Gelé may have been a bit of a nuisance with his molds, but he really did provide evidence that you cannot escape. Produced under conditions that are faultless. If it wasn't for that, you'd look at some photographs of Kluski's sittings and you'd think, my goodness, what a load of fakes. And because, no problem putting a sort of a stuffed bird on somebody's shoulder, why not? There are 2 confusing things about the photographs. One is that the faking could have been done so much better. These were not stupid people who were trying for the first time to do something. Fake photographs of spirits had been around for ages, so you could really do better than the stuffed bird or a bit of sacking or what have you. And the other thing is, every photograph, they took 15 photographs, 2 weren't successful, so every photograph taken is described in detail, how they take it, what equipment they used, who took it, and how they developed it, and their interpretation of it. And their interpretation of it is that they took it at the wrong moment. By the time the magnesium lit, the photographs, the apparitions were dematerializing. And when you read the full accounts, seems a lot of the time the apparitions seem to be using physical material to create themselves. So who knows? I don't know how they formed themselves, but you have a problem with these photographs that they look so fake, and yet anybody with half a brain, and you're talking about people with, military experts, professors and whatever, they really could do better. So again, there is a pattern. When you look around at other photographs from other mediums, they also look really weird. So, and all the photographs were taken at a very early period of the sittings, because later on, I think lights became so important, and of course you can't be photographing lights, so they sort of abandoned it and concentrated on the molds and the lights.
Let's talk about the molds. These molds have been discussed, as you know, in an interview we've already released with Leslie Kane, who visited the institute, the Metapsychique Institute in Paris, where they are kept locked in a safe. They were made by Gilly, who was the president of that institute back in the 1920s.
Yes, indeed, and they are really amazing objects, not because it is impossible to create molds like that by natural means, but because of the conditions under which they were created. I think there are about 3 ways of basically, you can just sort of, puff up your hand and sort of, by putting a tourniquet on and sort of make it swell and then pull it out. You could have materials that dissolve, or you can cut things through while the paraffin is still very soft and subtle, and you can just reseal it. For that, you need time, you need light, and you can't do it sort of under the conditions when they were produced. So, of course, the other explanation is he smuggled them in. Now, the thing about that is, not to mention the stuff that Gelle and Riche put in to make sure this was the same paraffin that was on the table. But so many accounts, and there were hundreds of them, are of people seeing light, fingers of light, dipping into the paraffin and coming out, and things splash around. And you get a warm paraffin mold in your lap or in your hand. So that is, that would involve lots and lots of people basically either being fooled or being accomplices. So no, I really cannot get past the molds, however hard we all try.
When you combine the laboratory conditions with the eyewitness accounts, it makes some of the skeptical arguments irrelevant. But you bring up the Sherlock Holmes dictum, that once you eliminate the impossible, and of course, to a skeptic, these things are impossible. Therefore, no matter how improbable the fraud might seem based on all of the accounts, it must therefore be fraud. If you assume that this is impossible, then the only way these molds could have been produced is through some sort of fraud.
I'm afraid that it all is where you're starting from. I find it's not just the molds and all the evidence, however impossible, but I also find it impossible with Kluski to reconcile his personality and his whole life with basically playing silly tricks for no gain whatsoever. Now, unless he had some sort of dissociative problem, but even then, there isn't the time. I have sort of, looking at his life, there just isn't the time to spend producing fake phenomena, arranging these things, getting accomplices in, and things like, okay, these phantoms, perhaps it might not come through as clearly in my book as it does in the original, where there's so much more material. But if you have the same phantom of I don't know, I might get it wrong now, but I think it's a sort of 18th century lady appearing in Warsaw and then appearing in Jelly's lab. Well, you have to bring the accomplices and all the props, and that's just not on. So, as I say, there comes a point when you look at it and you just think, well, the world is a much stranger place than I thought, or you just ignore it like I did for so many years.
Well, these things are so bizarre and so rare that they're easy to dismiss. We all have to, go about our business from day to day, and for the most part, it seems irrelevant, even if true. So how is it going to affect my life?
Exactly. And actually, that was Franek Kluski's attitude as well. He had these gifts. He didn't make use of them, and he said, life is for living. It's okay. He thought, and I think that was very much his attitude. He thought he was helping science discover some new human resources. And then he got fed up with producing all these molds and, various phantoms walking about. So he gave it up, especially as it really made him sick.
Well, we should talk more about the health effects, because many mediums seem to suffer physical illness from doing that work. It takes a toll on them. Certainly
physical mediumship, very much so. I mean, Hume was a sickly person. Palladino suffered very badly. I haven't really, Indridi Indridason died young. So yes, there is a history of that. And I know from what I've read that many mediums have had, some mental mediums as well, had traumas of some kind. So perhaps that's what you need to become a medium, sort of, not be quite fully physically complete.
There is a sense that people who have been traumatized in one way or another, you could say it sort of blows a hole in the membrane that normally separates human beings from supernatural experiences.
Well, and there's also the evidence, as far as I know from my reading, it happens to near-death experience people who often develop strange, not necessarily gifts, not if you go around and disturb all the electrical equipment around you. You wouldn't probably be too pleased, but that's what seems to happen. So there seems to be a sort of barrier that we have that stops us, stops the other stuff wandering about. And let's face it, what chaos would arise if you did have phantoms wandering around and you couldn't say who is real, who isn't.
Let me ask you about Gilles. He's the person who reported most of the materializations in the scientific literature. He was, I believe he was a medical doctor. How were his reports accepted?
Oh, he was very controversial. I find his reports, perhaps they are too summary, he tends to summarize. On the other hand, if you do what I did, which is go through this book on Kluski, 600 pages of, report so-and-so, date so-and-so, and then what happened bit by, it can drive one mad. So I can see why he did that. But then, of course, he was accused of not reporting properly. I can see that point of view as well, because sometimes I think I read him and I think, I wish he made it clear who was where at the time or what exactly happened. But I also think he was very good experimenter in terms of bringing out the best. I mean, we all know now about the experimenter effect and how some people cause phenomena to just run away, and some people who make them enhance the situation. And I think he must have been very, very good at that, because he got a lot of, another famous, or perhaps sometimes famous, sometimes infamous Polish medium Jan Guzik, with whom Gelle experimented as well. And he seemed to get really good results with Guzik. But all of Warsaw was laughing at not Gelle, but Guzik performances, because everybody knew he cheated when he didn't have to produce.
And that was quite common with mediums. I mean, Palladino was known to cheat if you gave her an opportunity.
Yes, but from what I've read, her cheating wasn't that good. When reading Ochorowicz, he said, you could, and Carrington, you could tell straight away, if you were an experienced investigator, and if you told her, she would stop. Because sometimes she would just do it unconsciously, and sometimes, of course, when you think that somebody's making a living out of this, then of course the temptation, the motivation is there, and in fact, Guzik made a very good living out of it. And as I say, one of his animals turned out to be a sock with 2 fluorescent spots on it. And as I say, everybody enjoyed the spectacle rather than take it that seriously.
But in the case of Kluski, I'm under the impression that there was never any hint of cheating, was there?
No, there never was. No, you could say he could have cheated. There were situations where the controls were not perfect, but then there never was any motivation to produce things for public consumption. I honestly don't think that would have been the motivation. I may be totally wrong. I'm easygoing about things, But I don't think he cheated. He could have cheated over things that were reported outside of seances, like the lights going on and off, his colleagues laughing that they knew when he was at work because the equipment would stop functioning properly. or they would have to leave the room when he came in after he walked along a sort of, strongly scented, avenue with flowers. So he had something very strange about him, and lights, again, seeing lights in his mouth and generally around him, reported in other situations. So, no, I think whatever happened, I don't think that is an adequate explanation that, it was all cheating. No.
Well, it's a very interesting case history, a historical example of something that is very hard to come by today, although not impossible, as we know from Leslie Kane, who says she's witnessing similar phenomenon right now. Now, the book that you used as the source for your book, as you mentioned, is a lengthy 600-page book published in Polish. So you had to translate it, and I understand that it's a very rare book. If somebody wanted to read the original book, they would have to go. There are probably a few libraries that still have it.
Well, I think a few still may have it in Poland. Yes, probably they do. I have a copy that's falling apart. Obviously, it's been worked through. But what I did was, by now, I translated all of it, and it's the next project. It needs an unbiased expert examination, just to see, what opportunities there were for deception and self-deception and any loopholes, and there were many, and how far they would affect the phenomena. That's our next project, is to produce a commentary on the full translation for researchers to look at and, compare it to other things that I may not be aware of, so that it's there for future reference.
Zofia Weaver, thank you so much for sharing your investigation of this most fascinating historical episode. I think it's extremely important because I suspect, people with similar talents are going to come along, and it will be so helpful for people to have a historical context when that occurs.
Well, absolutely. I mean, it happened to me. If Alan Gould hadn't got me looking at D.D. Hume because of D.D. Hume's Polish connections, I probably would have felt, a bit more dubious, not so well motivated. So yes, historical. I'm all for having continuity, not just sort of jumping into one event and making a judgment.
Well, Zofia, thank you so much for being with me.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you for having me.
And thank you, those of you who are watching, for being with us.